the specific wine. So Bien Nacido Chardonnay usually was coming from only one block, Block W. Block W is part of the bench, is part of the east-west planting that we originally had on Bien Nacido proper when we're talking about planting originally in 1973. So Block W was as far east as you could get. It was on the border of our property with another winery, Cambria, next door. And it was originally planted on these 12-foot row spacing, really wide, so the tractors could get in there and work the fields. We actually went back and planted in between old, young in the mid-90s so that we could get twice as much Chardonnay in there. For most of the time we've been making Bien Nacido, it came from Block W, whereas in 2018, we actually started to pull a little bit of old vine material from Block I. The reality is that unfortunately, within the Central Coast and even within Santa Maria Valley, viruses are something we have to worry about. Pests are things we have to worry about in the field. We try to do our best to manage those as much as we can. For example, there's something called the glassy winged sharpshooter, or there are moths as well that come into the vineyards, and they'll lay their eggs and they almost create these like spider webs in the grapes. Well, what we do is we use something called sexual confusion, where we'll put pheromones hanging on the vines, every other vine, and they put off the scent that smells like one of the sex. I can't remember which one it is. It must be the females. And what it does is it drives off the other ones because they say, hey, there's already someone here. I don't want to set up camp in this little part of the vineyard. And we do that to manage pests. We've had, unfortunately, a little bit of virus in the vineyard. And you know what virus, at least leaf roll virus, what it does is you get wines that tend to be big and rich and powerful, but they barely get ripe. So sometimes you can have, picking in October and the vines still aren't ripe yet, but they've lost all of their acid and they're having a hard time getting what we call phenolic ripeness. So where all of the flavors that we like, especially in something like a Chardonnay, where we have a bit more of the tropical papaya mango tones, you're gonna end up with something that's more akin to green apple and tart and tangy. So we started in 2018 to add not only W, which was the heart of the cuvee, but adding a little bit of I, because we saw that W after 47 years just started to do less and less and less effective ripening in the vineyard. So we added I, which is a little bit more towards the west, which means it picks up a little more of that wind and balances out the fruit that W is getting with that tart green apple, with more of that tropical papaya and mango. And that's what you get here. The one interesting thing, if you have the wine in your glass right now, you'll notice it does have a little bit more golden hue to it. We didn't do anything different. This is just a fact of the vintage. We had to do a lot of sorting in this vintage. We had a lot of water berries, and in February of 18, we had a huge frost come in, and this was right about 10 days after bud break. And if you know, as soon as you start to get those little buds starting to grow and then you get a frost come in, we have to do what we can to prevent that. We actually spray the vines with water, and what it does is it freezes on top of that little bud, almost creating like a puffy coat. And that puffy coat protects it from getting colder than 32 degrees, right? Water freezes at 32. And so it means that even though the weather around there might be 10 degrees or 15 degrees, really too cold for grapevines, we have that little bud protected by that. Unfortunately, what happens though is vines have short-term and long-term memories. Old vines are great because old vines know what they did when they had a frost in 1982, and then they had a frost in 1988 and a frost in 1997. They kind of know, great, we'll start over again. We'll put out a second set of fruit or second set of growth and it'll be fine. Younger vines though, because they don't have that long-term memory, will say, uh-oh, what happened here? Are we not going to make fruit this year? Are we going to have to make 3 times as much just to be able to get something ripe? And that's what happened in parts of the vineyard, where we had a bunch of really great, perfect fruit, and then we had a lot of water berries where really, I mean, it's like it sounds. You put them in your mouth and you're expecting to get some of the fruit character that you would get from Pinot Noir, from Chardonnay, from Syrah, Grenache, and they literally taste like nothing. And so for us, we had to go through and remove by hand so many of these little water berries. And what that meant is that it left behind a lot more of the concentrated, perfectly ripe fruit. And that's why you get this more golden color in the glass. It's probably similar to what we saw in 2012, but for different reasons. 2012 was just a really ripe, unctuous, voluptuous vintage, and we got more color like this. 18, it happened to be because of the water berries that we had quite a bit of. It still is super vibrant though. It does have a good amount of texture to it, which is something I don't generally associate with such a young version of Chardonnay, but it's not showing any of the young characters I would usually get. You know, young, freshly bottled meaning always has this banana leaf or like banana skin kind of smell. It doesn't have that at all. It does have a cool balance of like pear skin and green apple skin, but definitely a melon character. And I mean, like, which one's the golden one? Cantaloupe. It has like a cantaloupe melon quality to it, and that is from a good amount of ripeness, but it's not lacking that beautiful acidity that we always love. Cool thing about this wine, it is only 12.6% alcohol, and that's great because there are two things that you want in a white wine to be able to age it. The first one is acidity, and the second one is phenolic ripeness. So phenolic ripeness happens in the vineyard, acidity happens in the vineyard as well, and is managed by the winemaker. Just think about if you pickle your own vegetables, right? In spring, right, people like to pickle asparagus or ramps. I know ramps were going off this year. Those pickled ramps obviously need to go into something, and we use vinegar. Well, wines have their own acid as their own background. They have malic acid, they have tartaric acid, and they have lactic acid if you do malolactic conversion. And so that malic acid, that green apple acid, is what you want to have. And that only comes by making sure you haven't let it ripen out. So what I mean by the lower alcohol at 12.6 is that if we let this wine continue to gather sugar, sugars go up, but acids go down. And so the higher alcohol you have, typically you'll see less ageability with any wine. There's a balance which comes in, and if I'm getting too nerdy here, you can write it in the chat or tell me to stop. But there's a balance because as you tend to get more ripeness in fruit and sugar, you're tending to get more vibrant, like voluptuous flavors. And in an old wine, you're trying to make sure that you're balancing everything, right? You want the fruit to maintain its presence. You want to get some development of these secondary bottle flavors, and you want to taste what the wine originally was supposed to taste like. Well, a white wine with a lot of acidity and lower alcohol is going to maintain that consistency for a lot longer, meaning it has a big, great, long plateau. Really ripe, alcoholic, fruity wines, however, will tend to be really, 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 really fruity up to the point that they hit the peak. And as soon as that fruit starts to fall off, primarily because of just aging, the acid really takes a dive. So they don't have a long plateau. Really fruity and high alcohol wines, let's talk about something like 16% alcohol Syrah from maybe Paso Robles, right? They'll taste great right out of the gate, and they'll taste great for 6 to 8 years, and then that fruit starts to fall off and it dies like that. It is literally like that peach that you should have ate yesterday, right? You know, if you went, peaches are great right now too. It's a great peach season. You get that peach and like, you know what, I'm not hungry. I think I'll probably have it tomorrow with breakfast, a little bit of, you know, granola and Greek yogurt and whatever. You touched it and it was soft and you say it'll be fine. You get there tomorrow and it's like leaked all over your counter. That's kind of how those high alcoholic, really sugary, not sugary, but fruity wines are. And that's kind of exactly opposite of what we're trying to make. We want the wines to taste great today, which the Chardonnay really does, but we also want it to showcase itself for 15 years where the fruit is keeping pace with all of the elements, right? It's like a perfect little box and you got all the elements in the corners that are all coming together in that, you know, perfect spot in the middle. Really, really beautiful. I think, if I was going to cook something tonight with this, just run into the grocery store, you know what would sound good just because we have the peaches on the counter? A really nice Faro salad. Faro, it's those grains. They almost look like bulgur wheat, right? Faro salad, not too seasoned, right? Because you have to boil it almost like rice. Arugula and like maybe a mixed green salad with a homemade dressing. We like to use a good amount of mustard, Dijon mustard, as well as honey in our dressing. And then we have a lot of different vinegars in our house. Tonight, if I was making the salad, I would probably say this pineapple vinegar that we got from Tahiti. It's amazing, literally made from pineapples, and has that balance of tart, tangy acidity and that fresh floral character of pineapples. And then we would do it with some shaved Parmesan cheese and then grill those peaches. And it would be just the most perfect wine with this. There's no recipe except for the one that comes out of my head. So Faro, mixed greens, whatever great vinaigrette you want to make, grilled peaches and like shaved or grated Parmesan would be an incredible, I guess, aperitif salad to start off with this. Now, as we move over into the Pinot Noir, so I first like to look at the color of all of the Pinots. Bien Nacido always tends to be lighter than Solomon Hills. It's just because of the nature of Solomon Hills. It's on lighter soils. It's windier, so therefore it causes the grapes to get thicker skins. And it tends to have a little more Pommard clone in there. And the Pommard clone always has a darker color and more of this sauvage, wild animal kind of smell to it. But looking at this wine, it does have great consistency all the way through. Although the 18 vintage does look a little more pale than the 16 vintage does also. The other thing about it, and I'm holding the glass at an angle, looking through the top so I can see the core and the rim all together. The other thing about this is we did a really great job on racking this wine. Anthony, Trey, Connor, all the guys at the vineyard, I think did an exceptional job just looking at the fact that it really doesn't seem to show that this wine is unfiltered. Like all of the wines, even the Chardonnay, all of the wines from the estate are unfined and unfiltered, which means we don't add anything to the top of the tank that's heavy to bring down the solids and make it clear. This is something like if you're making consommé, chefs will do this, where they'll take egg whites, you put the egg whites into the top of the consommé, you stir it, and it creates what's called a raft. The raft on top has a little hole where it's bubbling in the middle, and all of that kind of brings the heavy stuff out of the consommé, and you get this beautiful see-through clear broth. You do the same thing in winemaking. A lot of people will use something like egg casein, which is egg whites, which will be heavier than the wine and float all the way down, taking those big particles with it. Some people will use isinglass, and isinglass actually comes from the bladders of fish, and some people will use milk solids as well, and they'll use heavy milk particles and they'll put it on the top and it sinks to the bottom also. All of these are used to fine the wine to make it clearer, and then people will pass it through a filter. We don't do any of those things at our winery, primarily because we're trying to showcase as natural a product as we can, meaning everything happened in the vineyard and we don't need to worry about it in the winery, right? We just need to shepherd it through the process, not do a bunch of chemistry and a bunch of all these other things to it. So when you look at the wine, I mean, the first thing that I noticed is whoever racked this and whoever made sure that this wine was getting into tank clean without a lot of lees did an incredible job. I mean, this is just really clear, really precise. I can't see anything, even hazy, in the glass. And that's great because it'll mean that this wine will stay vibrant and vivid for a really long time. Now, as all of the Bien Nacido wines for the Pinot Noir, we generally pull this from 5 or 6 different blocks on the property. Because Bien Nacido is so big, and forgive me, let's see if I can get this back. Oh no, no bueno, it's not gonna work. Because Bien Nacido is so big, we have about 700 acres planted, and we want to do our best to get east, central, high altitude, valley floor, high concentration of planting all the way through. And we can only do that by pulling from a bunch of different blocks. So for us, we picked 6 different blocks for this one. Block 1, Block N, Block Q, Block G, Block 40, and then Block San Vicente right behind the vineyard. All of them offer their own unique take. The dominant portion of this is Block G. And if you've ever been to the property before, you may know our vineyard manager, Chris Hamill, lives up on the hill. His house is this beautiful gray, kind of old school looking wraparound porch, country home. The vineyard block that is right next to his house is Block G, and it's on the heaviest soils. Those heavy soils really give us more fruit and more texture to the wine, whereas Block 1 tends to be herbal, Block 40 tends to be mineral, San Vicente tends to bring some of the black fruits, the almost blackstrap molasses qualities, and Block N and Block Q give us those old vine characters, which tend to be a little bit more complex. And so the heart of this cuvee is Block G. This has been open for about an hour, and it's amazing. The first thing I smell out of it is almost this orange zest, lifted quality. It's really, really cool because the wine is concentrated and has density. But the orange zest really, really is quite unique. I don't think I remember smelling this anywhere except for the 16 vintage Syrah, and that had like a grapefruit pith. So this is really cool. It's very clean. And what I mean clean, like, you know, when you take a strawberry out of the fridge and you smell it, you can tell that it smells like strawberries, but it's not the same as if you left that strawberry on your counter for 2 hours and let it sort of warm up. This has that character of like cold, clean fruit that hasn't quite warmed up yet. And this is still at cellar temperature. This is a wine that I usually would drink right out of cellar temperature, but honestly, it needs to open up a little bit. If you're gonna drink this wine, open it at 3 o'clock for 7 o'clock dinner, I'd say, which all of you hopefully have. It does have a little bit of green kind of herb lifted on the top. It almost has this like mustard greens quality, and I think that's just from the fact that it is fairly young as well. That'll go away in exchange for the fruit in a while. Wow, really cool on the palate. It's the opposite of what I was expecting. When I talk about cool fruit, in the wine world, sommeliers use this term like crunchy. And crunchy to me means that it's like snappy, right? When you bite into a cranberry, the skin crunches or snaps. I expected the palate to be like that, but it's so much more soft and textural. It's really luscious, really like, I wouldn't say viscous, but smooth. And about that, it's just the ripeness of the fruit at the right time. And I think it's about us taking those water berries out, leaving behind everything else that was concentrated, and making sure that what goes into the glass, it could be as ripe and balanced as possible. It's interesting on the back end, there's a little bit of this tannin that kind of comes through. It's a little more gritty, and I like that because it makes me think of something like a grilled steak, right? The outside of the steak having that char on it gives so much more depth to the flavor than just the steak itself. If you just did it in a pan with butter, you wouldn't have the same flavor as you'd get if you did it on the grill. And so that little bit of bitterness back there from the tannins, and that most likely comes from the grape skins and a little bit of stems, kind of makes me want to put this with something that has like a bitterness of its own. I think like Saba, which is like concentrated balsamic vinegar, or even like balsamic would be cool, like a balsamic glaze. I think of things like mustard greens, or I think of kale, even sometimes spinach, because spinach can have that, like, it's called oxalic acid, has that oxalis quality to it, which would be really cool. And honestly, this wine is a little too much for like chicken, right? Unless we're doing something like a coq au vin, where we're putting the chicken in like a red wine sauce and, braising it for a long time. It just has too much stuffing. I'm one of these people that I agree that sometimes you can put Pinot Noir with chicken, depending on the preparation. But here, if you just did like a roasted chicken in the oven, almost anything you're going to put with it is just going to be a little too delicate for this wine. It does have a lot of stuffing, and that's the cool part about it. This wine has guts, even though it doesn't look like it in the glass. I mean, this wine has layers and layers and layers of complexity. And so it's harder to find something to cook with. Like, I think beef stroganoff would be really good, especially if you use a lot of mushrooms in there, or even like Swedish meatballs would be yummy. Beef bourguignon, of course, with something like black truffles would be fantastic. Not to say that everybody has black truffles at their house, but that would be really amazing. I don't know, what would be something that you have around the house all the time? Oh, you know what would be really good with this? Like a ramen soup, where if you're using, like, I like to make my own ramen broth at home. We use beef stock as the base of it. Then we do like Chinese 5-spice in there, so it brings like that clove and allspice kind of quality to it. I like to put a lot of soy sauce in it, so it brings that umami flavor. And I really like to use fish sauce as well, because the fish sauce brings that layer of like a little bit of funkiness, and each of those layers of flavor kind of add to it. I think that would be a really cool textural element with this, especially if you rehydrated some like dried porcinis in the broth, so they give off their own like mushroomy flavor. And then, you know, not too many toppings. I mean, to me, something like pork or even chicken in this case in such a heavy broth would be cool. And if you guys don't know how to make your own ramen broth at home, I'll give you my recipe too. It's very, very simple. Water, beef bouillon cubes, add about a tablespoon of Chinese 5-spice, probably about 2 tablespoons of soy sauce, about a tablespoon of fish sauce, and what else am I going to add in there? Oh yeah, I always like to add seasoned rice wine vinegar as well, because it makes it more vibrant and kind of causes it to pop. And then you don't really need to add any extra salt or pepper or anything to it. It should be a pretty great base. Add those porcini mushrooms that are dried to let it rehydrate, and you have a perfect broth. Thinking through that though, I'm like, it's 108 degrees outside. Who wants to eat ramen right now? But it sounds delicious. So maybe we save one of these bottles for winter and have it then. All right, I've been talking for 40 minutes. If you guys are there, we did this as a meeting where I'm happy to answer questions. So you can take yourselves off mute. You can show your cameras if you want to. If you don't want to show your cameras, that's perfectly fine. But I'm happy to answer any questions about glassware, about these wines, about how the 2020 vintage is showing, really anything for you. Well, great. I want to thank everybody for coming. And as always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to anyone in our tasting room. You can reach out to Julie, Kari, Antonio, Jerry, or myself, and I'm very happy to answer those. And if there are very specific questions about the wines and you want to get technical and nerdy, Anthony Avila, our winemaker, is exceptional, and he really does a great job breaking it down so that we can all understand it. I did a cool video with him last Tuesday talking about whole cluster fermentation, and it was really fantastic. So happy Saturday, everyone. Thank you all for coming.